For 17 days this past summer, the world watched as the whale known as Tahlequah carried the body of her dead calf. She pushed it with her head, she pulled it with her teeth, and she kept it afloat as she swam over 1,000 miles through the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Tahlequah had given birth to her female calf at the end of July, only to watch it die after just a few short hours. And if you tuned in like I did on a daily basis to see how she was doing, to see where she was at, to see if she was still carrying this baby, you know that this motherly display of grief was moving and heartbreaking and often very difficult to watch. This was a huge news story, and not surprising because although scientists had seen whales mourn this way before, they had only been known to do it for a few hours or maybe as long as a day. So almost all of the news stories focused on the unprecedented length of this grief journey. And the fact that Tahlequah's baby wasn't able to survive pointed to the declining health of these animals. So almost all of the news stories focused on the ways that these whales have been endangered by pollution and by development. And for me, while this was absolutely incredibly fascinating, this was not the most powerful or important part of this event. What almost none of the stories focused on is that the other whales in Tahlequah's pod took turns carrying her calf and helped to feed her during this 17-day journey. They were often spotted gathered around her, and they swam alongside her the whole way. They helped her to mourn. They helped her to carry her baby. And it is this support and this help from these other whales that I want to focus on with you today. Because if there's one thing I've learned, grief needs a community. For 14 years, I anticipated my own grief journey. My mother lived with cancer for that long, and as I cared for her, I knew that cancer was going to take her from me one day. She was diagnosed in October 1997, and she died on August 18, 2011. Her name was Eulalie Francella Charles, and she was the greatest. During all that time, I thought I knew what to expect. I thought that grief was feeling sad and missing the person who had died. I thought it would last a little while, and I would move through some stages in a nice order, and then I would get over it, and I would move on with my life. Yeah, no. My actual experience of grieving Mummy was nothing like that. Grief meant sadness, yes, of course. But it also meant fear and anxiety and rage. It meant grinding my teeth at night. It meant getting tinnitus in my ears. It meant developing panic attacks for the first time in my life. It meant depression and isolation and confusion. It was far more painful and traumatic and exhausting than I ever could have imagined. And shocking. How did I not know this? How did I live this long and not know that this is really what grief is like? But this is the paradox of death and mourning in our culture. We see spectacular and violent images of death every day, on TV, in movies, online, in the news. And we see candlelight vigils when celebrities die with thousands of people. But ordinary death and mourning, those are experiences we contain and avoid. We don't see the person whose body wastes away from disease in the hospital. And we don't see the person who can't get out of bed 2 years or 3 years or 4 years after their husband or their wife or their child has died. I didn't know what grief was really like because nobody ever really talks about it. Grief upsets us. It makes us uncomfortable. We live in a society that values positivity, and we are all expected to put on a happy face no matter what. So we want people to grieve in private and at home. Or maybe you could grieve openly at the funeral or at the wake. But once that's over, it's time to keep your head up, get busy, and carry on with the business of living. As I grieved my mother, I couldn't do any of that. I was very obviously sad. It was clear I was not functioning well. I couldn't hide it. There was no happy face for me. As the months passed, I started to feel embarrassed about my grief, and I felt guilty that I was burdening other people with my pain. I started to realize that I was upsetting people, and that just made me feel shame. It made me feel shame to be grieving and upsetting people. I started to stay home more so I wouldn't have to go out and be sad in public and bring people down. Some people disappeared from my life because they didn't know what to say or they didn't know what to do. Some people tried to fix me, and when that didn't work, they just gave up. So what helped me? What helped me to heal? What got me through? Like Tahlequah, I couldn't do it alone. What I needed was for my community to hold space for my grief. That's it. It sounds so simple, I know. When we hold space for somebody in pain, we offer them our presence without judgment, allowing them to be however they need to be, even if it makes us uncomfortable, especially if it makes us uncomfortable. Instead of trying to give advice or provide solutions, we just sit with them in their suffering and we just listen. We give up trying to control them or change them, and we just give them connection. Think about it as building a container that will hold somebody as they express and feel whatever it is they need to express and feel, even if it makes us uncomfortable, especially if it makes us uncomfortable. I had to say that twice because holding space for somebody's grief is not easy, and I am not here to pretend that it is. Most of us are really bad at it because of these struggles that we have with painful emotions. It goes against everything we've been taught. And to be honest, to watch somebody that we care about in pain is hard. We want to cheer them up. We want to tell them what to do. We want to make things right again, because then maybe they won't feel bad. But more importantly, then we won't feel bad. We won't have to feel uncomfortable anymore. But that doesn't actually work. That doesn't help people feel better. What works is acknowledging that somebody's in pain, listening to what they have to say, and just being with them in their hurt. Maybe they have nothing to say at all. So instead of saying, "I know just how you feel," we could try saying, "I can't imagine what you're going through right now. Do you want to tell me about it?" Instead of saying, "Look on the bright side," we could say, "I'm sorry you're hurting. Can you tell me what it's like for you right now?" It's hard to understand why doing this is so hard for so many of us, because grief has always been the most common human experience. And we don't just grieve when somebody dies. We grieve when our children grow up. We grieve when we have to move away from home. We grieve when our best friend stops talking to us. All of these griefs are hard. All of these griefs need space to be held. And now, as we look towards the future, we are rapidly moving towards widespread experiences of loss that humans haven't had to cope with before. On top of growing income inequality, political instability, rising fascism, how are we going to hold space for somebody who is grieving because they have lost their job to a human-like robot? How are we going to hold space for somebody who is experiencing ecological grief because of climate change? How are we going to hold space for somebody who is in utter despair because our governments just don't seem willing to do what needs to be done? We need each other to get better at it. When people held space for my grief, I felt seen and I felt heard. I felt safe. They held space for me so I could take my time and work my way through my loss. Part of the way I worked my way through my loss is I went back to school at age 40, changed careers, and became an artist. It was a busy time. And now what I try to do is I try to help other people work through their grief, even just a little bit with my art. I try to hold space for all kinds of grief with the projects that I make, both for the people who participate and for my audiences, the people who look at my work. And everything that I'm sharing with you today comes from my own experience and from the research and the learning that I've done to make these projects. So for example, with It's Good to Be Needed, I was thinking about the sadness that comes when a relationship ends. And so I held space for women who were ex-partners, but not friends, to meet and to hold hands. An act of intimacy that was an attempt to shift some of that lingering sadness. And as I held space for them, they held space for each other in being willing to do something so vulnerable for my camera. With this project, Parade of Champions, I was thinking about the ways that I felt more vulnerable to racism and to homophobia after my mother died. It was like grief on top of grief. So I held space for people like me to talk about the ways in which grieving our mothers had been shaped and affected by our blackness and by our queerness. So I held space, we listened, we shared stories about our mothers, what their deaths were like, what our grief experiences had been like, and also just to honor the love of Black women who had loved their gay children in a world that tells them they shouldn't. And finally, with this most recent project, Suck Teeth Compositions after Rashad Newsome, I was thinking about the sadness and the anger and the frustration that comes with having to deal with racism when you live in a country like Canada. So I held space for people in my community in Toronto to release some of that frustration by sucking their teeth for my camera. You all know how good that feels. And I built a collective symphony, which was a release of this pain and a release of this frustration. With all of these projects and with my talk today, I'm asking all of us to try to hold space for grief. We cannot help somebody to heal by trying to take away their pain, by trying to cheer them up, by trying to fix them. But what we can do is put aside our discomfort and just acknowledge that they are hurting, and that they might be hurting for a very long time. Like the whales in Tahlequah's pod, we can hold space to be with them in their pain and help them carry their burden. As we face the future together, we know more change is coming. We've already heard about some of them this afternoon. And change inevitably brings loss. We are all already grieving somebody or something. And now we are collectively facing new and unknown losses still to come. So I ask you, today, tomorrow, next week, next year, whose grief will you hold space for? And who will hold space for your grief? Because all we have is each other. Thank you.